Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today on the podcast, we are delighted to have with us Matthew Quick. And Matthew is the New York Times bestselling author of the Silver Linings Playbook, which was made into an Oscar-winning film, and 8 other novels. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages, received a PEN Hemingway Award honorable mention, was an LA Times Book Prize finalist, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a #1 bestseller in Brazil, a 2016 German Youth Literature Prize nominee, and selected by Nancy Pearl as one of the summer's best books for NPR. The Hollywood Reporter has named him one of Hollywood's 25 most powerful authors, and Matthew lives with his wife, the novelist Alicia Bissett, on North Carolina's Outer Banks. And we have Matthew with us here today because he has a new book coming out, which was just released on November 1st. It is called We Are the Light, and one of the central characters is a Jungian analyst. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to talk to you, Matthew. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the show, so it's an honor to be here.
Well, I want to jump right in with perhaps the most important thing that we're going to talk about today, which is how about those Phillies?
One of the interesting things is that I got sober about 4 years ago, and one of the things that came with new sobriety is I don't watch sports anymore, which is interesting, and it surprises people, but sports and sports watching was so entwined with my drinking. And, I've come to kind of analyze and think about whether I really even enjoyed watching sports, or was it just an excuse for me to drink a lot of alcohol in a socially appropriate way. So it's very complicated for me. So I am very happy for everyone in Philly. And I know one of my best friends runs a news station there. So they had, he had prepped everybody going out on the streets to see all the craziness. So my heart goes out to everybody in Philly for sure.
Well, and I wanted to bring it up because, of course, you have a Philadelphia connection.
Yes.
And I know at least several of your novels, including this one, are set in the environs of Philadelphia. Do you want to just talk a little bit about your connection with this part of the world?
Sure. So I actually was born in Pennsylvania, and I spent the first couple of years of my life in North Philly. And then I grew up in Oakland, New Jersey, which is about 15 minutes outside of Center City. And I went to Collingswood High School. And then I went to LaSalle University, which is in North Philadelphia. And then I taught in Eastern High School in Voorhees. And I taught in the Bancroft School in Haddonfield. And I taught for a while at Haddonfield Memorial High School for a while. So I have deep Philly roots. My parents have a house in Ambler. My brother lives in King of Prussia. A lot of my friends are still there. So my accent has kind of morphed over the years, having lived in the South and in Massachusetts. But, I still have Philly in my heart for sure.
Well, greetings from Philly.
Thank you.
So you had mentioned working in a high school, and your protagonist, Lucas, also works in a high school, which seems to be in some ways autobiographical. So what is it about working with young people that informs the book and kind of informs your own sensibilities?
Well, I originally went into teaching because my father thought being a fiction writer was a terrible idea. And, he told me that I needed to major in something that would afford me the ability to have health insurance and pay bills. And so my big plan was to become a teacher because I thought it would be really easy. And I thought, well, you get to write novel, you get to, read novels and talk about writing, and you have the summers off. And I thought, you only work from 8 to 3. And then of course I became a teacher and realized you work, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you have no time. And by the time you get to this summer, you're so exhausted that you just want to fall down. I think subconsciously I was drawn to working with young people because I did not have a very good experience being a young person. And I felt very lost and alone. And I felt as though I was not getting information that I needed when I was young. I found it very easy to work with young people because I feel like I understood the problems that they were having. But it became very obvious to me early on that one of the things that I was doing in the high school was picking up the slack, the things that weren't being addressed, and particularly in Haddonfield, where there was just a tremendous pressure on the kids to, get into Ivy League schools, compete, have this amazing persona. And so there was a lot of, shadow element where kids were just relegating their real needs. As an English teacher, if you present yourself as approachable, kids tend to write a lot of personal things in their essays, and they bring to you a lot of material. And so I became this kind of very unprepared default counselor for a lot of kids. And at the time, I took that role very seriously. Now I look back and kind of shudder because I was a little more than a child myself, and I was not prepared for that. I think I did the best that I could, but I saw a tremendous hunger and a tremendous need everywhere I looked. And those needs were not being addressed. And I don't want to cast blame on anyone. I just think it's the system. It was get the right test scores, get the right SAT scores. When I left, I started writing about it. And, I wrote the Silver Linings Playbook first, which is an adult book, but then I started writing YA books, and then teenagers started writing me letters about those. And so my writing was never meant to be didactic or, it was more, I felt called to write about certain things. And then people told me that those things were hitting the mark for them. And sometimes that's a complicated reality, because while I'm glad that, sometimes when I write about pain or mental health problems or trauma, that resonates with people and that they feel seen. Obviously, I would much rather have it that those people never had trauma or felt that way. So it's a complicated dance.
I'm just resonating with you, Matthew, from my personal history, starting out as a special ed teacher working with high school students, and how educators made such a separation between what was, quote, education and what was, quote, relationship or counseling or, a personal connection. And it's such an artificial divide because, of course, teenagers need a relationship. So I doubt very much that you were any more unprepared than anybody else in terms of offering heart and relationship and connection.
It was surprising. I remember the first day of my student teaching, one of the teachers pulled me aside and said, everything you learned in school, just forget about it, because none of it will be relevant at all. And it was so shocking to hear that. And I remember also one of the first days in one of the schools I was working, someone put up a calendar and said 179 days to go. And it was a countdown until summer. And it was just, as a young, hopeful teacher, I didn't understand that response until I taught for 5 years. And then I understood that it was rolling this huge rock up a hill every day, and being asked to perform miracles for almost no pay, and being yelled at by parents for doing it, for attempting it. So there are saints in every high school, and I know them and I've met them. They're wonderful, amazing people that make it long term. And I do think that the work that I did was really important. And when I left, the superintendent pulled me aside and, he said, you've done really good work here, and now you're going to take that and you're going to reach more people with your writing. And it was a really beautiful thing for him to have said to me. And I didn't really believe it at the time, but now when I look back in retrospect all of these years later and see that my books have been read all over the world, it's kind of a mind frame, and it's something that all of us can do wherever we go.
So then you were published by the time you left teaching. Is that the...
No, I turned 30 and had kind of a freak out moment where I thought, I'm 30, my life is over. I'm so old. And I haven't done all of the things I wanted to do in life. And so my wife and I, in very much a fit of youth, I would say, we sold our house and we traveled for a while, and we had made a little money on the house sale very accidentally. And I moved in with my in-laws, and I wrote in their basement for several years and did a creative writing MFA, and everyone thought I had gone completely insane. And looking back now, it does seem like a radical thing to do. And I never would have predicted the success that I've had. But I do feel that was an integral move. And I remember my Uncle Pete, who was my most unlikely cheerleader. He's this very gruff Vietnam vet. He pulled me aside and he played the stock market, and he said, risk and reward. I totally get what you're doing. You're all in. You're taking a huge risk to get a big reward. And at the time, it was more, I was so burned out from teaching, and I was so beaten down from trying, the hopeful, idealistic young person just got kicked in the face every single day for, 8 years. And my anxiety was very high. And I was really trying to save myself. I didn't feel like I could hold it together. I remember the last year I was teaching, I loved my students and I loved teaching, but every day I would walk into the building and think, I can't do this. I feel like I'm going to have a breakdown. I felt it was just the accumulation of many, many things where I felt that what I believed in and what I was trying to do was so opposite of what the system was trying to do. And that kind of youthful naivety that kind of allowed me to fly through the first couple of years of my teaching career was gone. And so I had to find a way to be who I wanted to be in a way that I needed to be that would allow me to be mentally well. I also was going in every day and telling these kids who were they're brilliant kids, and they were all being pushed into the math and sciences because that's where the money was. And I was saying to them, if you want to make art, if you want to write, you should do it. And I thought, man, you hypocrite, you're going in and telling these kids to do the thing that you're not doing. And so that was also a moment where I thought, well, if you're going to preach, you've got to live. And so I went out and tried to do the thing I was telling my students to do. And luckily it worked out somehow.
So I'm thinking about your book as you were talking, We Are the Light, and that love is a central theme. Unexpected love from people, from Lucas, from the town. So it makes me wonder, how was love relevant both to your experience being a high school teacher and perhaps even present in your work as a writer? How has love been a theme?
I would say that it's something that I have craved intensely for my entire life. And there were a lot of really beautiful and surprising moments of love when I was a teacher. There were times when I remember there was one woman in the community. I had taught both of her, or two of the three of her kids, and every year at the end of the year, she would write me this beautiful letter, kind of outlining the difference that I had made in the kids' lives. And I remember the first time I got it, it wasn't long. It was just a short letter, but it just choked me up. It moved me so much. And I remember there was this one student whom I just noticed the first week of school that she just looked sad every time I passed her in the hallway. So I said to myself, well, I'm just going to try to make her smile every day. And it was a student I knew. She was in my class, and I had coached her. And so every day, I would just high five in the hallway, try to get this kid to smile. And the kid would light up. And I remember at the end of the school year, this student telling me that she had been shunned by all the other girls. And I didn't know this. And that I was the only person that would say hi to her in the hallways.
Oh,
and it was this huge thing for this young person that I wasn't even aware of. It was just kind of a game for me. You know, I was like, let's just see if I can make the kid. And I would high five all the kids, you know, but specifically, I always kind of intuitively thought, oh, I've got to make sure this person gets a smile today. And when I left teaching, this young woman wrote me a beautiful letter that I had no idea any of that was even going on. I didn't know that it was a lifeline for this person. And I was very overwhelmed by that. And, you know, to be honest, too, you know, my comrades, you know, some of the other teachers, some of the older men in particular, I remember one of my friends giving me a Pat Conroy book, said, you need to read this. And then I opened up the first page and it was like, to the next Pat Conroy. And at the time, as a 28-year-old young man who was dreaming about that, whose own father had told him he was an idiot for thinking that, to have an older man kind of affirm that for me, as simple as that seems, was a huge moment for me. It was just really, really, really beautiful. So there was a lot of that. And a lot of my students were incredibly hungry for love. And I would say they projected onto me, you know, big brother, father, all types of roles that I was not really conscious of in my 20s. And I think that in some ways that was a good thing, because I just kind of used my intuition to do the best that I could without over intellectualizing it.
Yeah.
And I look back on that time as unintentional prep work for laying out the philosophy of my novels and my books. And I keep going back and mining that to get these stories.
Well, there's such a parallel in this book, We Are the Light, of reaching out. The main character reaches out to an outcast high school student, a real pariah, and befriends him and mentors him in a way that is singular and very, very moving, and brings him into a developmental and personal trajectory that's astonishing.
Well, thank you for that.
The role of Eros really cannot be underestimated. And I especially resonate from my own high school teaching years of how hungry the kids were.
And how teachers dig into that deep well of love and concern that you feel. I remember days when I had taught all day and I thought I was exhausted and wiped out. And then some kid would come in with a crisis and you would sit down and you find out you had a little more in you to give that day. And I think it's also important in the novel, Lucas, when he's kind of tasked with helping Eli, it's Eli who shows up in a very kind of unconventional way and forces that relationship. And it's mutually beneficial, although it doesn't seem as though it would be. And there are times when I was teaching, I thought I was giving a lot, and I thought maybe I was giving too much. And, you know, I would run out of things to give. But now in retrospect, I look back, and especially through my writing, I see how much I was getting from that community as well, and being part of that community, and that those kids were really giving me a lot too, not just a sense of purpose, but, you know, when that student I would high five in the hallway, would smile back at me, I was getting as well. And I didn't really think about that as a lot when I was in my 20s. And nor should you. As a teacher, you shouldn't be expecting to get things from kids, but you do. It's a two-way thing. It's
a real love affair with relationship that you lived as a high school teacher, and it certainly shines through in the book. How enriching it is to have real relationships. I just thought your book was so much about the power of love between Lucas and Eli, and Lucas and Jill. And certainly the glorious story about the town. I don't want to give too much away, but how, you know, these terribly saddened, tragically afflicted people all come together to generate something that is glorious and crazy and creative and just glows in the dark. I've rarely been so moved by such a rendition of the power and the delight of love in a book.
Thank you.
Several themes of love in the book, just as Deb was saying. And I just wanted to pick up that, being a bit digressive, you had said that perhaps naivete had bolstered you over the several years of teaching, in a sense kind of protecting you or giving you a sense of courage around it. But as you were talking, it's clear that love and eros also both protected you, supported you through all of those trials. And the book also touches on that, the love between Lucas and Carl, his analyst, and the love between the different characters. And I'm reminded of part of a letter that Freud had written to Jung in 1906, where he famously and oft-quoted said, "Psychoanalysis is in essence a cure through love." And so the love between Lucas and Carl, he and his wife, and then Jill, and of course Eli, it's a theme that moves, as Deb was saying, through the entire book, the relationships and the depth of feeling that people have for each other.
Yeah, and also Lucas's relationship with Isaiah too, which is very intimate. And Isaiah's very hands-on with Lucas, and he likes to pray with him and touch foreheads, and is very physical in this way that's, I think, particularly lacking in men. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s around, war veterans, I was not touched as a boy ever by men. And that was something that I didn't know that I needed. And I remember sometimes playing basketball with my friends and, would score a basket and somebody would hug me, and just how shocking that would feel and wonderful. But at the same time, it just felt so almost transgressive to me in a way that I knew was not right. So I think Lucas has this tremendous amount of love to give, but he also experienced this horrific trauma, and he's not sure how to give that love. And I think he's very lovable, but he's not quite sure how to accept that love at times as well.
It seems to me that there is, in both your stories of teaching high school and in the book, this kind of intergenerational support and love, and even sort of fathering. It's a kind of father love that gets transmitted. So you had the older teacher, give you this wonderful kind of affirmation, and you were able to kind of mentor and in a sense be fatherly toward your students. And of course that happens in We Are the Light, where Carl is a sort of father mentor for Lucas, and perhaps, I don't know if you'd consider Isaiah in that category too, but it seems like maybe yes. And then of course Lucas is able to bring that same energy to bear on his relationship with the young Eli. So it's a wonderful transmission of a certain kind of love.
It's important to receive and then to give. Darcy, when she visits Lucas, is always saying the boy is the way forward. And all of these people are trying to love Lucas. Jill comes and loves him immediately. Isaiah loves him immediately best, and then he has to find a way to give that love to someone else who needs it. And I think that's really kind of a very human task, to receive and to give love. And I think particularly my own wounded masculinity, I think, prevented me from feeling that I was able to be loved or was lovable, but then also to give love in a certain way freely. And that is something that I've been working on in analysis, and it's something that I was trying to work on through my writing. And I think that a lot of men have that wound and have that particular problem.
So one thing that we haven't touched on that, of course, bears a relationship to all of us three is your knowledge through your character, Lucas, of Jungian terminology, Jungian concepts, relationship with a Jungian analyst. And of course, that was a special delight, I'm sure, for the three of us, and I think will be wonderful to many, many readers of what Lucas's process is that's been informed through his analysis.
Yeah, and so I was writing this in real time when I was in analysis, and in some ways it's very intimidating to come on the show and talk about this. And it's interesting because I've been rereading the book and seeing how, in some ways, it is a mirror of where I was a year and a half ago when I wrote the book. But I was always young curious, is how I'd put it. And I wrote a book called The Good Lucker Right Now, which kind of is tongue-in-cheek about synchronicity. And I didn't really know that much about Jung. I just read, pop kind of things. And so when I got sober, I tried to lone wolf it for a long time. And after 3 years of that and horrible writer's block, my wife introduced me into This Jungian Life podcast. And she said, you should start listening to this. I think it would help you. And I remember binging, the whole backlist and feeling very called and moved by not only what all of you were saying so beautifully and offering, but these ideas. They just felt right for me. And so I entered into analysis, and very quickly my analyst was giving me tons of books to read, and I was immersed in it. And I kept thinking, what am I going to write? I have to write. And then the light bulb kind of went off, and I said, I should write about my greatest fear. And at the time, I was receiving so much help from my analyst that I was terrified that would go away, or that I didn't deserve it. Or somehow, of course, that my punishment would be for believing in this process, that it would disappear suddenly. And so I thought to myself, well, what if I wrote about that greatest fear? And so Lucas, when he experiences this horrific tragedy, his analyst disappears and writes him this note that says, I can no longer practice. And he's left with this gigantic hole, and how to fill that. And so he tries to use what his analyst taught him, the Jungian philosophy. And so I was both indulging that kind of fear that I had of my analyst abandoning me, while my analyst was doing such a beautiful job of supporting me at the same time. So I was kind of living this split, and I'm sure we could psychoanalyze that all day. But
sure we could.
Yeah. And so as it was helping me, I was rushing to get as much of it as I could in the book. And in some ways I feel that was very therapeutic for me, and maybe even part of my analytical process.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've often thought that writing a novel is sort of an extended active imagination.
Yes.
So you were really engaging something important in the inner world while you were crafting this beautiful novel.
I was blocked for, it depends on if you count the screenwriting or not, but 3 or 4 years. And then all of a sudden the floodgates just opened. And I remember very early on in my analysis getting angry with my analysts and kind of yelling, when am I going to write? I'm doing all of this work. And I remember him telling me, when psyche decides it's okay to write, you'll write. And I've been doing a lot of pieces about writer's block. And I was a writer who always thought that writer's block was an excuse for, people who were just being lazy or something like that. And then it happens to you and you become a believer in writer's block. And I talked a lot with my analysts about how in my early sobriety, a book tour might have killed me. And I'm very much an introvert, and I was not ready to go out in public in my early sobriety. And so I really do think that psyche shut me down and put me in this kind of protective place that led me to analysis. And then once I had a year, I think it was 100 hours, it was some 3 hours a week under my belt, all of a sudden, just this floodgate opened, and it almost felt like channeling the novel.
Wow.
So it was very much like having a waking dream. It was very much, you could say like an active imagination, but a lot of times when I'm writing and I'm writing well, I don't feel that I have complete control over where the book is going. It just seems that something is coming through me.
It's autonomous. The unconscious is autonomous.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's another theme in the book between love and power. And while your protagonist, Lucas, is coming forward with this highly relational, eros-laden dedication, there are other characters who are very upset by a tragedy in the town and really want to exercise power, protective power in a way. And Jung famously said that where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, there love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other. And so, in terms of Jung's ideas of enantiodromia, that one thing can become the other, there's a dance between love and power, which of course seems like extremes, but in some kind of strange aquifer in the unconscious, they are two ways of being in relationship.
Yes, and I love that quote, and that was very much on my mind as I was writing. And I think we see today, there's plenty of awful things in the world that we're bombarded with every day on the news. And I think more and more, something that I've seen that I find worth pondering is this kind of rush to power. That we must do something, we must, create the good guy and the bad guy, and we must set up this, these poles, and we must attack, and we must make laws. And I understand that all of that is very important, but I think what has gotten lost maybe in the collective lately is this need to love. And especially when we're talking about teenagers and young people. And so in the book, you have Lucas, who has this calling almost to put love back into the town, to love people, to love as much as he can. And then there's another character by the name of Sandra Coyle, who thinks the best way to do this is to rise in power politically and to become governor of Pennsylvania and to change the laws. And of course, there are two different strategies. And in the book, they can't find a way to make those two things go together, and they become kind of opposed. And my character is consciously really trying to find a way to engage with Sandra, and in her way, she's trying to find a way to engage with Lucas. But they want very, very different things that don't seem to go together at the same time. And so I was playing with that, which I think is very alive in the collective today.
Yeah, I loved that kind of tension between those two characters and those two approaches. And one of the things that struck me about Sandra was that she was having a hard time dropping into just grief and acceptance.
Yes.
And it's the way that desire for power and control can be a defense against feeling. And I thought you showed that really, really well.
Thank you. There's a charge there too. And I think Sandra and Lucas there's an attraction, and they both have this dance that they're pulling each other. And I thought, in the end, there's a resolution that I thought was truthful, I should say. I won't spoil it.
It's such a parallel to the dance between eros, love, and power with your experience as a high school teacher and in the collective of, does it have to be one or the other? How do we hold the tension so that we can have both? A kind of achievement, perhaps a social justice orientation, if you will. High school kids getting into some kind of higher education process or vocational training, plus relationship.
Yes.
I think the book really does a great job of pointing to a resolution of how the Sandra character and Lucas come into a new place.
Yeah, and one of the things that I do as a writer is I use first-person unreliable narrators. So there's a little bit of dramatic irony where you have to, as a reader, piece together what all of the other characters are doing, because we only get it through Lucas's point of view. And so if you look with the right eyes at the novel, you see that all of these other characters are both engaging with the political and also with Lucas at the same time. And so I think, like the librarian Robin, I don't think she's quite so fractured. I think she's right there in that good place where she's engaging with both sides in a way that is very healthy. And so I think both Sandra and Lucas are, kind of splitting to the opposite poles and doing their thing on both sides. But I think the majority of the people in the novel are probably right there in the middle in that healthy place.
I loved the use of the unreliable narrator.
I did too. And Lucas is such a great example of such insight on the one hand, and the ability to self-reflect and create hypotheses and, what he's putting together about himself with all he has learned from his Jungian analyst and what he completely misses and fails to understand about himself. That is, isn't that all of us?
I think so. Yeah. And it's always a character study, right? So I'm always trying to present my characters as they are in the moment, not as we wish they were. And I think that's where we find their humanity, as you said.
I was also intrigued that you chose to make it an epistolary novel. In other words, that's a word I have to wrap my tongue around every single time. I think the last time I read such a novel was Bram Stoker's Dracula, and your novel goes exactly to the opposite polarity. But it worked really, really well because it gave us such an incredible relationship with the main character. We know him. We're inside his head in the letters that he writes again and again and again.
And I've always been a letter writer myself. Even since I was a young boy, I've always had pen pals. And when I was blocked, my wife had suggested writing another novel through letters. I've done it before, and her theory was you can still write letters. You haven't been able to write a novel, but you've been able to write letters to all your friends. So, and then the writer Nick Butler echoed that without knowing that Alicia had said it first. And I've really resisted it for a long time because not everybody likes a novel in letters. And I had done it before. And so I did not want to do it that way. But as soon as I wrote the words, "Dear Carl," I just was flying. I was off. So I didn't really have a choice in the matter.
That's great.
Yeah.
I want to go back for just a second, if that's okay. You said before that you've always been young curious. Mm-hmm. And I found myself, when I was reading the book, I found that I was really curious about what role Jung had played in your life. When did you discover Jung? How old were you? What did it do for you? How did it sort of live inside of you until this recent experience? When I just would love to hear more about that.
I think I started hearing about Jung, or I was aware of who he was somewhere in my 20s, but I don't really have an origin story. It was just, I'd pick up little things from reading a novel, or somebody would talk about him. And then I would say in my late 20s, early 30s, I got really interested in the idea of synchronicities and synchronicity. And so that was kind of the entryway in. I think because I'm an INFJ and I do things intuitively, school was very strange for me because I knew things that I didn't understand why I knew them. And so math was very tricky because sometimes I could figure out the answer, but I didn't know how I did it. And so I could never pass math because of that. And so I think when I started to look into Jung a little bit more and things about the collective unconscious, I was really curious about how I was processing the world. And it made me feel instantly less alone. I've always felt, especially as a child, even when I was praised for things, I didn't understand how I'd done them. I remember in 6th grade writing a short story and my teacher reading it to the class, and I didn't understand why it was good or why she liked it or why it was being singled out or even how I had written it. So there's always that sense of, I don't understand how I work and like what I am. It was, and when I started to get more interested in Jung and read more, especially through my analysis, I said, oh, like here are all of these things that really not only light me up and make sense to me, but make me feel that perhaps there are other people that are engaging with the world. And particularly when I started listening to This Jungian Life and with the dream analysis at the end and the talk of fairy tales, these were things that I've always been really curious about and kind of intuitively knew that there was medicine in them, and I didn't really know why. And so as I started to get the vocabulary and the language to put around that, it felt very, very grounding to me. And as if I wasn't just kind of floating out in this kind of nowhere region where things were just kind of, I didn't understand how I was processing them, but all of a sudden I had a vocabulary and understanding and a way to access this. So it felt very much like a bread trail that, okay, I have or a North Star, or, a lodestar.
What an honor that we here on the podcast were able to play a role.
Yeah, it's a very big role
in your
too.
journey.
Yeah.
And in the creation of this book.
I'm struck by your experience of feeling alone and how letters inherently are fueled by yearning.
Yes.
So yearning is a kind of pole star. It sounds like perhaps for you personally, but certainly throughout the novel.
There's a line in the novel, I forget where it occurs, but Lucas says something like, there's no greater pain than speaking plainly and still being misunderstood.
Yeah.
I've often felt that way. And I think that a letter is really a place, at least for me, where you can kind of stretch out. And sometimes in the daily life of back and forth chit chat, there's not really enough space for you to put all of what you're trying to work out into play. And so I think a letter in a lot of ways is a place where you can, it is a monologue. It's a place where you have the mic and you can say as much as you want. And I often think too, that sense of yearning for intimacy. And I think letter writing is scary to a lot of people because it is, in some ways, if you do it the way that I like to do it, it's putting your soul on the page in a very vulnerable and intimate way. And in a way that you can't take back or dismiss because it's a document. It's something you're giving to somebody. It's almost like the access key to your soul. And once you give it away, they have it. And there's something dangerous about that I've always felt is powerful. And also there's the expectation that the person, or there's the hope that the person will be as vulnerable and honest and dangerous on the flip side and write you back. And how hard it can be when that doesn't happen, when you put yourself out there so vulnerably. And so for Lucas to have the bravery to come back every week after week after week and open up his soul in this very vulnerable, beautiful way and contain the fact that he's not getting a letter back is really an act of bravery. In some ways, I wonder if it's masochistic in some ways, in some strange ways, but it also is reflective of the experience of analysis too, where if you're an analyst and you come in week after week and you in real time kind of offer this vulnerable letter, if you will, and audibly to your analysts, and you don't get to know, what's on the other side. And there is a magic in that. There is a secret in that. There is something that happens that I think I intuitively knew, even as a very, my first pen pal, I think I had it at 12 or 13. It was a young woman in Virginia I'd met in OBX on the beach. And man, did I pour out my soul to that person. And sometimes I think, I worry that she still has those letters, it's a dangerous thing. Like, what would people do with those?
But it's a wonderful illustration of how much an other, and in Lucas's mind, an other that's in his imagination.
Yes.
But that we need the other imaginally, or, in a consulting room in analysis week after week, to help us connect with ourselves, so that it goes in two directions. It goes between, let's say, me, and between a me and a you. And it's a wonderful dance of what's out there, what's in here, what's in imagination, what is a lived reality, that I think the book conveys in a wonderfully heartfelt and very wise way.
It was interesting inhabiting Lucas's psyche and writing from that point of view. It was very intense for me. And there were many writing days when I was just crying, and it was, I always know that I'm on to something when I feel very, very strong emotions while writing. And that is not something, I wish that was something I could fake, because it would be much easier to write novels. But for whatever reason, inhabiting his psyche at that time produced an incredible amount of emotion in me, and was very wonderful to write, but difficult and scary at the same time. And I'm always telling hopeful novelists that if they want to create something that works on the page, you've got to be a little afraid of it. You've got to offer up something that is dangerous, that you might be a little reluctant to show people at first, because that's really where the truth is. That's really where the magic is. And I think with Lucas, that level of vulnerability and that level of fragility, that his psyche, from the very beginning that he's very close to fracturing, and holding that tension throughout the novel was hard to do through the writing process. But in a lot of ways, that's what many of us are doing every day.
But just as your novel, really is about, I think, the power of love in a multidimensional way, what happened to me as a reader is I fell in love with Lucas. It's impossible not to fall in love with Lucas and to see his fragility and all that he does. And yet he extends himself. This dangerous, wonderful, foolish bravery that he exhibits relationally was such a way of including the reader in all of that.
Yeah, and I think that idea of, the fool stepping over the edge of the cliff, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I think, we're watching Lucas the whole time with one foot over the cliff. And I think in some ways we're like, don't go over the cliff. But in other ways, I think a lot of us feel, we want to put our foot over the cliff too.
Well, Matthew, what I'm thinking of is when you told that story a little while ago about here you were kind of dangerously burnt out at age 30. The ground must have been pretty unstable beneath your feet in lots of different ways. And what did you do? You quit your job and you got an MFA. Yeah. I mean, I think you sort of, and I was so impressed with that actually when you said that a minute ago, because you obviously are the kind of person who is able to throw yourself into the fires of life.
Well, thank you for that.
And that is true of your main character as well, as Deb was saying. To kind of rush forward even in the midst of great uncertainty and suffering.
That are the opposite of that. I come from a family of very pragmatic Protestant bankers. And I remember my last duty as a teacher was chaperoning a trip to the Peruvian Amazon jungle. And our river guide boat was, this man is an expat from America. He's about my father's age. And I remember drinking beers with him under the stars in the riverboat on the Amazon and telling him, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be the novelist, And I remember him clinking the glass and just saying, leap and the net will appear. And I remember thinking at the time, it was this beautiful moment where I couldn't believe that an older man was condoning what I was about to do. But he had just moved to the Amazon one day and left America and, figured out how to do it. And it takes a little bravery, but it also takes, people, when I did that, a lot of people said, wow, it's so brave, especially when it works out. Everyone thinks it was really brave to do that. But I don't see it as an act of bravery so much as a last-ditch effort to save myself.
Yes.
Because if I wasn't in so much pain walking into that building every day to teach, I would have easily done my 20 years and I would have been retired by now. But it was that I couldn't walk into that building anymore. I was in so much pain and suffering that I had to do this. It wasn't an option. I was going to go to a very bad place if I didn't change my life in a radical way. So it's hard, because it sounds so, I don't know, maybe even narcissistic to say like the writing life chose me, or like I was born to do this. But I think my life has really been about surfing very intense emotions that I didn't at the time understand. And then realizing that something was pushing me in different directions. And I still, even to this day, have issues with anxiety. And I did a talk in Denver earlier in the month, and I was going to speak to these booksellers who are the most wonderful people and the most giving and generous people in the world. But the whole time on the way to Denver and the week before, I had extreme anxiety. And I was thinking, why is this? This is what I want to do. These people are going to be very kind. And the whole time, even the night before the talk, I was like curled up in a ball in the bed feeling this extreme anxiety. And then the next morning I went down and I gave the speech and it was amazing. And everybody was so kind and wonderful. And I remember talking to my analyst afterwards and him saying that this might just be a form of how you get into a state. This is a form of crucifixion. You need to go through this process in order to give the talk. And so it's not an act of bravery so much going through that as an act of submission, to submit to something and say, this is maybe what I've been tapped to do in this moment, or this is where I am, and this is where I'm being pushed by whatever force, and submitting to it and allowing yourself to be broken by it.
Yeah, I love that distinction between bravery versus submission. And I think you're exactly right about that. And we are asked to submit to whatever our fate is. And some of us have a hard time doing it, though, Matthew.
I would say I have a hard time doing it as well. I mean, it's not easy. It's difficult.
Well, when we think of suffering as a conversation with the self that needs to be respected, that needs to be honored, then there's at least a hope that the transcendent function that Jung wrote about will activate. And whether it's a new career direction, which you experienced, shifting from being a high school teacher to being a writer, or it is some other part of alchemical transformation that's being pressed into us and through us, if we can develop a kind of trust that suffering is a kind of prayer, that I think grace can emerge from it, which I also see as a major theme in your book.
Yes.
That there is an example that Lucas is giving us, that he is holding his suffering, and out of that, things are generated.
Yeah.
His new relationships, his confidence in redeeming the shooter's brother, his ability to step out of prescribed roles that he may have had as a high school staff person, and to experience himself differently within his own life and within the culture. And one of the things that kicks in for Lucas is a religious feeling. So he's been exposed to these terrible traumas, and some life-saving part of his psyche introduces him to this profound experience of angels. It's as if the religious function arrives to encapsulate his trauma as he is trying to metabolize it?
I would say that that surprises Lucas as well.
I'm wondering about your personal religious experiences. Jung wrote extensively about the decline of religious imagery in modernity. He thought it was a significant psychological problem because we no longer had a way to imagine archetypal forces.
I grew up in a very religious family. I went to the Methodist Church in Collingswood, and it would probably be described as fundamentalist Christianity. And so there was a very literal interpretation on the Bible, but I was taught all of the biblical stories. And I would say in high school, I started having maybe a very different reaction to all that than my family was having. And, I hesitate to say this, but I would find myself feeling moments of ecstasy in church or around religious thought, to the point where I considered, becoming a minister for a while. But I also found that these feelings I was having, I was afraid of them, and I felt I didn't understand them. And in the church I was in, again, everything was very literal, and it was very much about fitting a prescribed order and being seen in a certain way. And yet I was having all these very uncontrolled feelings. And I remember going on youth group retreats and taking some of the stories. And, I remember one night we were singing, and then we were supposed to go out into the woods and commune with God at night. And I remember having this really euphoric feeling, this really kind of sense of God being very, very real. But then coming back and talking with my friends, and they're like, yeah, we smoked cigarettes in the woods. We were, that did not happen for us. And feeling kind of ashamed about that. And so there's always been this kind of dance with, as I kind of moved away from the religion of my family and my youth, and kind of moved more into symbolic thinking about it. Where does that go? What to do with that? And even just small moments, like my grandfather before school every day in high school, I would go and eat with him, and he would hold my hand and pray. And that was one of the few times anyone ever, especially a man that I love, would touch me. And there was something magical about that moment. I think my grandfather would have viewed it much differently than I experienced that, and I was very aware of that. But I felt that, and as I've grown up and made my way into the world, and especially in academia and the publishing world, and leaving behind my world of religion, I do find myself aching for that religious experience, and it's always popping up in all of my work, very unconsciously, and maybe to the detriment of my book sales. I don't know. But it's something that I feel very much drawn to. And I do think that my work in Jungian analysis is giving me a frame to re-engage with that in a healthy way that I feel is very good for my soul.
But, Matthew, I really think that you speak for all of us in our collective, and the hunger and the yearning for a felt experience, for being touched, literally and metaphorically, religiously, that we are all hungry for this feeling function and experiences of the transcendent. Is something that our culture is in horrible denial about, and yet then we have all of these unhealthy compensatory actions, acting out, polarities, conflicts, etc. And so much there, obviously in you and your life and in this book.
Well, I think also in terms of my alcoholism, I'll tell a quick story. When I might have been 9 or 10, I went out onto the ice behind my school, and the ice was too thin, and I fell in, and I went under very deep. And I remember being underwater 8 feet and thinking, how am I going to get out? Coming out, and the ice was there. How am I going to find the hole? And then all of a sudden, it felt like something lifted me up, and I went through the hole, and someone threw a rope, and one of the fathers pulled me out, and the police came, and I remember one of my aunts who was religious, like creating this image of me being pushed up by an angel, and thinking, in my youth and my religious training, I must have been saved by God, or an angel came, and thinking about that had meaning at the time. And then, of course, I went to college and cast off the religion of my youth and thought, that was just some kind of freak coincidence, or must have been something underwater I stepped under. And then for the next 20 years, I got my spirituality through spirits, alcohol. And so that was what really replaced kind of the religion of my youth was drinking in some ways. And it was not a conscious thing that happened, but I've often thought about that link between, lack of spirit and imbibing spirit, and trying to find some sense of transcendent or some sense of something else through drinking.
Which, of course, is exactly what Jung said in his letter to Bill W.
Yes. Yeah. And so, thinking back on, whether an angel came and helped me out literally or not is not really important, but symbolically, there was some type of frame for my young psyche at 9 years old to kind of wrap its head around, to hold that for a while. And so, I think about that a lot, and I do feel hungry for those types of experiences or, frames, we could say. And I found that the Jungian work I've been doing is really filled a void there for me, and given me a sense of grounding that was lacking for a long time, especially through my sobriety. It's really been helpful there.
It sounds like when you were writing, you were talking about how deeply emotional it was, and how it was an experience of being swept along. This wasn't an ego-driven process at all.
No.
It sounds like it was, in a sense, a bit of a religious experience, would you say?
I would say when I write well, I hesitate to use that language because I know so many people will, outside of perhaps the Jungian community, take that to mean something that it's not. But I do think that it's a form of surrendering. I do think that it is a religious experience.
In the sense that we're in relationship with something larger than ourselves.
Yes, well put. Yeah, and that is much easier for me to say, because I think the religious experience has a lot of baggage for me from my childhood. But I do think that I am letting something come through me. I think that to some people that could sound grandiose, but in the way that I mean that, it's the complete opposite. It's surrendering the thing that my ego wants. My ego did not want to write a book in letters. My ego did not want to particularly even write this book, but this was the thing that I had to surrender to and allow to come through me.
And it's a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
I'm also interested in the transformation of the Majestic Theater.
Mm-hmm.
So, set in this small town, there's a tragedy that happens at the theater which initiates the storyline and all of the changes in Lucas and in the community. And at one point, towards the end of the book, the entire town returns to the Majestic Theater to view a movie that this young boy has created with Lucas's support. And I found myself thinking about how we have a tendency to be drawn to the sites where traumatic things have happened. Visiting the concentration camps in Germany is horrifying and compelling at the same time. There's an interesting word in German called Kitzel, K-I-T-S-E-L, which is part of the social sciences in Germany, trying to describe what is it about these locations that people want to continue to return to them with such intensity. And Kitzel speaks to the way that the soul vibrates, that it's both horrified and also compelled. For some people, it can even have an erotic tinge to it, as well as a spiritual feeling. So that happens in the background with the Majestic Theater, that it holds both these terrible memories, but something in the community also wants to repurpose the theater, wants it to remain intact rather than just razing it to the ground. I think that's an incredible metaphor for our lives, the way in analysis we revisit the place of the crime and try to find a relationship to it, to not abandon it, to repurpose the traumatic things that have happened to ourselves. And it's also a collective effort in the book as well. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about our relationship to the places where traumatic things have happened.
Yeah, and I think the word that Lucas uses in the book is to re-sanctify the space. You know, that definitely has a religious connotation too. But you have to feel to heal, right? And I think Lucas, without giving spoilers here, is really dancing with his shadow. You have these mirror images of these two boys in the book, these brothers, and one of them shoots people and the other one shoots movies. And they're kind of a flip mirror image. And so why does one boy shoot people and one boy shoot movies? They both had this same horrific upbringing. They've both been outcasts. And I think part of it is that Eli has the benefit of Lucas re-sanctifying him, reaching out and giving him that love. And whereas Jacob, unfortunately, didn't have that experience. The Majestic Theater is largely symbolic. And I struggled with it too, because I thought to myself, would people want to go back to that place? Would people want to go back to a place where this horrific thing might happen? And then I thought to myself, and Alicia, my wife, talked about this at length too, well, why is there a 9/11 museum? Like, why do people go there? And what is it that they're getting from that? What is it that we're learning? And so I think you put that so well, Joseph, earlier. But I do think that there's this curiosity, but also this magnetic drawn to tragedy because we want to understand. And I think we also want to engage with the shadow side as well. And I think in the best of ways, when we engage with that shadow side, we understand it. And so Lucas is, again, without trying to avoid spoilers, his shadow side erupts in the novel in this very traumatic way that he's not prepared for, that he doesn't even know that part of him exists. And so the whole novel, in many ways, is an effort for Lucas to come to terms with that shadow material and get it into a proper container, so that he can function for the rest of his life, because it's thrust upon him in this way that he had no control over. And so I think that the Majestic Theater in some ways becomes this symbolic representation, not only for the whole town, but also for Lucas as well.
I appreciated that the book in some way was a little bit of a love letter to movies. And the power of movies to facilitate a kind of transformation. And of course, that speaks to the power of images and the power of the imagination. And there's no question that Lucas's imagination is a healing factor for him. Through the making of the movie, his imagination, coupled with Eli's, winds up being a healing factor for the community. So I guess I'm wondering a little bit about your relationship with film.
Well, I have a long relationship with film. It was one of the few things that the men in my life did with me. I remember as even a young boy, my father taking me to the movies. It was one of the few things we did outside of sports, going to see the Eagles play. And I think I preferred the movies to the sports. And I have one hilarious memory of my father taking me to see Rambo when I was way too young to see Rambo, and leaving the theater, and they wouldn't let me back. I had to go to the bathroom. And when I came back, the ushers wouldn't let me in because I was too young. But I think about symbolically, you know, my father's history with his father and his brother were war vets. And, you know, why was he taking me to that film? And why would we go into this dark room to look up at these images on the screen? Why was my father taking me to these movies? Or my grandfather too would take me to see, you know, like the Die Hard films. What was it that we were doing in this kind of collective dream? And then, of course, when I was at LaSalle, I was always going to, you know, the Ritz theaters in Philly and seeing the art house films. And I remember seeing Pulp Fiction and coming back in my band. I was in a band at the time. My bandmate said, you know, what did you think? And I said, I think that movie changed my life. And he rolled his eyes. I didn't know why I said that at the time, but if you recall, Pulp Fiction is told, you know, the structure is out of order. And so, you know, it's not linear. And it was the first time I really understood what a story arc was, because it was deconstructed and was out of order. I thought, oh, now I know what that is. And it was kind of a big transformational moment for me. But I think that for Alicia and myself, movies kind of became our church. You know, once we kind of let go of our religion, it was the place we went to sit in a room for 2 hours and to see something larger than us projected onto a screen in a way that helped us symbolically understand what was going on with us. And I think that that's why people unconsciously go to the movies. They want to understand things about the human condition that they don't understand. They want to see something larger than themselves. And so I've always had that dance with feeling drawn to go into this dark room and look up at the screen at the light dancing. I think that when the Aurora shooting happened in Colorado, it was so jarring for me personally, because that was my church. That was my safe place to go a couple times a week. And I found myself after that happening, like looking over my shoulder every time I went to the movies and checking the exits. And I had an unfortunate experience when we first moved to OBX. We went to see American Sniper, and there were these drunk men that erupted into almost like a fist fight in the movie theater. And it was very, very jarring to see that in a movie like that. And so this violation of this place that was, to me, sacred and holy, that sat with me for a long time. And I've been thinking about this story and how I wanted to tell it because of that. And of course, now as we're transitioning out of the movie houses and into our living room to watch Netflix, I feel something is lost, like this sense of community where we would get together with strangers. And even just the act of trusting strangers to sit with us alone in a dark room, that is an act of faith. Because we don't know the people around us, and we're kind of putting our defenses down and getting lost in a dream. We certainly wouldn't climb into bed with a stranger and have a collective dream with someone, but somehow in a movie house, it makes us okay to have this collective dream together.
And you laugh together and you cry together.
Yeah. And we don't do that as much anymore. And the movie houses are very much under threat, and they could be gone in a couple of years, unfortunately. So that to me is very alarming.
So as you're talking about movies, it leads me back to the roots of theater and the Greek theater, and that the entire process of drama rose out of the religious feeling in the cults of Dionysus. It was a way for the community to experience something vicariously and symbolically, which would exalt them and also relieve a certain kind of cultural tension, or at least that was Freud's interpretation of it, that we needed to see violence depicted, for instance, so that the unconscious would be sated and it would not need to enact that in the community. And with that in mind, imagining that violence erupting in the theater and the Outer Banks suggests such a rupture in the function of theater itself.
Yeah.
That the cathartic fantasy left the screen and incarnated, in these individuals, and what a failure of the process of theater making that moment would be. I want to come back to the idea that your father and grandfather initiated you through these war films, Rambo and other things, and how difficult it is for fathers to initiate their sons in the modern culture.
Yeah.
In your book, that theme is coming forward because the boys, and particularly Eli, is fatherless, as is his brother, who creates this tumult and tragedy in the town. So what are you thinking about the role of men in the community and fatherless boys who are seeking initiation?
The idea of father hunger was very much on my mind. And, it's interesting because I had a very close relationship with my paternal grandfather, but he did not have a great relationship with his father. And, my father struggled with my grandfather. And so these wounds, which I didn't understand at the time, were kind of handed down through the generations. And I spent a lot of time really angry with my father about that until I realized that he had not really been initiated into manhood because his father came back from World War II destroyed, and he just was not the same person. And I remember my grandfather talking to me quite openly about pretty much anything I'd asked him. But if I asked him about World War II, he would get really angry with me. Wow. And I remember when he went to see Saving Private Ryan, I've never seen him that angry. He was so angry about that film because it did not reflect his reality, and it put this kind of pretty bow narrative on something that was horrific to him. And he just kept saying, that's not what it was like. That's not right. And it was at that point that I realized that my grandfather had these wounds that were unfathomable to me. But those wounds psychologically had been passed down through the generations to me. And, Lucas has some wounds too with being abandoned by his father. And so he's tasked with this job to initiate Eli, and he gets help. He gets help from Isaiah, but he fumbles because, it's difficult for him because he doesn't have that structure. He wasn't gifted that. But this brings up the idea of the wounded healer, right? It's the people with the wound that can understand the wound, that can engage the most. And I've often thought about that because the wounds that I received from the men that I was raised by, who did their best and were not intentionally doing this to me, created this wound in me that produces the art that I create. And so it's this difficult relationship I have with the wound because I don't want the wound, but that is the thing that is driving me to make this art. And when I receive letters from men who say they feel seen in the work that I do, I'm grateful for that, but I realize that it's the wound and the pain that enables me to communicate that and to allow other men to feel seen. And I think there is a great hunger out there for men who want to connect with other men and don't know how to do that. And as I continue through my analysis and I start repairing my relationship to my own masculinity, at first I was very afraid to kind of bring that up with other men who aren't in analysis because I thought, well, what would my Vietnam vet say, my uncle would say, or what would my grandfather say? And they would have a hard time. But many of the men that are my age that I talk to about this, when I engage with them in an honest level, they are so hungry. Their eyes just get so thirsty to talk about these things, but they're also really afraid. There's this fear that they're not allowed to talk about this, that they're not allowed to love and be loved openly, especially by other men. And so one of the things that I hope that the novel will do is hold up this kind of example of men trying to love other men in imperfect ways, but doing it the best that they can, that it doesn't have to be perfect, but it just has to be genuine, and the medicinal qualities of that. And as I go around and talk to other men, as I'm starting to promote the book and some of the men in my life, again, I just feel this tremendous need. And I think in the culture, today, we're trying to make up for past wrongs, which is really the right thing to do. But I think there's this maybe unconscious feeling that men are okay, and like we don't have to take care of them, and that they can take the hits, and like we can kind of push them aside. They've had their turn. It's not their turn anymore. But the men that I encounter, that I've been intimate with, they're not looking for their turn. They're just looking for a way to feel okay. And there's not a lot of places for them to engage in a way that makes them feel okay. And they feel, I don't want to say they feel under assault. They feel more just lost and unseen. And I think that that's something that the collective isn't really conscious of a lot. And that makes me very sad, because the men that I'm engaging with, honestly, are doing their best. And they're not men that are hurting other people, but they're men in tremendous pain, and they're holding that pain in silence.
Matthew, I think you're raising such an important point, and I'm very aware as a mental health clinician that there are tremendous unmet needs among men, and just a few statistics to even kind of getting us talking about it. The rate of suicide in this country is highest among middle-aged white men.
Yeah.
And in 2020, men died by suicide almost 4 times more than women. So there is great, great hurt and pain among men. And you're right that we need to attend to other groups as well. And men are people too.
Yeah. I found too, through my work with my analysts, is I've healed my own wounds and started to feel better about my masculinity, that I've been able to be more generous. And one of the beautiful things that has happened is my relationship with my father has really improved. And I didn't realize that for most of my adult life, I was bringing a tremendous need to my father. I wanted him to be this person that he wasn't. I wanted him to correct all of these things that had happened 30 years ago. But when I let go of that and stopped bringing that need and started getting that need met through the analysis, I really felt that it unburdened my father. And one of the things that has happened lately is that he's become very supportive of my work. And he'll call me just randomly and say, I love you, and, I think your book's going to be great, and I'm so proud of you, and you're really doing this great job. Things that I look at the phone, I'm like, who is this man? This man that never told me he loved me for 45 years now says it every time I talk to him. And I think he's mellowed in second half of life. I think he's getting more in touch with his feminine side because of that. But I also think because I'm not bringing this burden to him, I'm not bringing this judgment, this shame, and saying, I'm not saying you should have been someone different, but rather than I can accept you for who you are and meet you on those terms. I really think that it's freed my father, and the love that he's been giving me now has been incredibly medicinal. And likewise with my friends, when I was first sober, I was very cranky. I was very unpleasant to be around, and I saw people mistreating me everywhere. And as I got further along in my sobriety and started dealing with those things in analysis and not bringing them to some of my friends, some of my guy friends have really shown up in these really beautiful ways. And some of them have had experiences where they've broken down. I have another friend that's in therapy, and we talk once a month. And this is a guy I never talked about anything with except for beer and Eagles. And now we talk about our love for our family and our love for each other, and trying to go into second half of life. And, we were reading the Richard Orr's Falling Upward together. And I would have never dreamed that was possible 10 years ago. I would have never dreamed that this friend and I would engage in this very loving way to each other, because for 25 years, all we talked about was football and beer.
Which is all you're allowed to talk about as a man in our society.
Yeah.
And I think I didn't know this. I knew this person. I loved this person, but I didn't know the depths of this person's soul the way that I do now, because we were kind of playing within the guardrails, perhaps, and it took a long time to break through.
I find myself thinking about this idea of what's permitted in masculine culture, and I questioned whether or not it wasn't permitted to talk about deeper things, because I don't know that that particular issue is policed among men. I think the issue is that it was never demonstrated.
Mm.
And if something isn't demonstrated, it doesn't feel possible because it isn't in the library of possible behaviors. So I think your story, Matthew, of simply introducing an opportunity with your buddy to deepen the conversation, to learn something together, and then to move into a different way of engaging, maybe as simple as offering it.
I think in this particular situation, my friend and I dealt with the trauma when we were 18, and we did have like a very intimate experience through that. I think it was a combination of things. I do think there was a part of us that felt we weren't allowed to be that way. But it definitely, I take your point about demonstration. We did not have role models for that. I would say that when I was teaching, the literature that I was teaching really often allowed my male students to engage with their feeling function in a way that they weren't able to do outside of the container of the classroom. And I saw young men often hungry to engage in that way. But then when they'd leave the classroom, of course, it was more difficult for them. And I felt that way too. It was what I would do in the classroom with my students was not what I was doing at the Eagles game on Sunday mornings when I was drinking beer. And maybe it would have been inappropriate to do it there. But I do feel that there weren't safe spaces, or there weren't containers for most men once you leave childhood, school, and not all men, and obviously I feel like I have those places now, but for most of my life, I think that I look back and I can feel the hunger that many of the men that I was around wanted for that intimacy. And some of the older men that I've been friends with, even as they see me go through this process, they're still reluctant. They still have a hard time connecting. I still feel like they don't feel like they have permission, even when it's demonstrated. So I think it's a mixture there. That's my read on it, that it's kind of both things at the same time.
I think I'm wanting to give a little time, at least, to the role of the feminine in the healing and redemptive process that this is so vividly thematic in your book, of the character of Jill, who kind of just is a steady presence. She's not as figural as some of the other characters, and yet there she is.
I think, again, with the way that it's narrated, a lot of Jill's glory, so to speak, might be off the page. She's doing everything to keep Lucas's psyche together. And in a way, she's kind of mothering him, giving him the mothering that he needs, and also trying to reintroduce him into this role of, having some type of relationship, even through sexuality as well, that Lucas is at times not ready for, and in some ways, I often think about Lucas, Darcy, and Jill, and Alicia said this as first, is kind of like a throuple, like they're this 3-person couple, because it's very clear that Jill also loved Darcy in a very profound way, Lucas's wife, Darcy. And so you have this very complicated triangle, and then one of those pieces are removed, and Jill has to actually do the work of both Darcy and Jill at that point. Like she kind of has to fill out that triangle for a while. But I see her as a very heroic character, as a star of the novel. And, some of the other women too, is particularly Isaiah's wife, Bess, and Robin at the library, and some of the other survivors. They're very heroic in their participation with Lucas and the way they hold his fragile worldview in this very gentle way until he's ready to let go of this absurdity.
I love the imagery of Jill and Robin, the librarian, of just quietly feeding Lucas. Jill is a cook, and of course, librarians feed us all kinds of books.
And I also think, too, that this image of the divine is feminine, too, because Darcy is she becomes this image of an angel. And this is Lucas's God, in essentially, like she's a goddess, and she's an oracle. She's a thing that tells him what to do, and so you have this image of the divine feminine that is really orchestrating everything, and that's what Lucas looks to. He's always looking in the sky. Where is the divine feminine? Where can I find it? So it's very powerful.
One more issue to just toss around is this tension around toxic masculinity and positive masculinity, which I think is substantial in the culture. As I read your book, I was aware of this demonstration of ways that men can care for each other, which perhaps we ache for and don't see as often as we would like. I was very moved by this small theme in the book of the local cop keeping an eye out for Lucas, who's often kind of wandering around in the evenings and perhaps showing up at places that he shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And the cop would just very kindly find him, just try to orient him, and then gently steer him back home. Didn't try to punish him, but definitely was this attentive authority figure in the book. And I found each of those encounters so moving.
And of course, it's loaded even more when, the cop figure Bobby was one of Lucas's former students that he helped out. So it's this kind of full circle moment where was the youth being initiated. And now he's the adult, helping the father figure out, which I think is a very beautiful full circle moment. And I think that those tender moments between men, we don't highlight them enough, and we're always hearing so much about toxic masculinity, which of course is a problem. But where are we putting the camera? Where are we focusing? And if all we see all the time is, toxic masculinity, where are all these other men supposed to learn how not to do that? In fact, I don't think we hear the term positive masculinity ever in the collective. And so, where are these young boys? What are they supposed to learn, if we don't show them what that actually is? So I thank you for bringing that up, Joseph. And, it's something that I think about a lot. And I feel that when I go out and talk about this, there's people and women too that are hungry to have these conversations. And people are asking, well, what is positive masculinity? What does that even look like today? It's not something that we really think about or define. And so I hope that the novel holds that up as a good example. And I think there are many men throughout the novel that act in ways that are healing, assertive without taking other people's ability to be assertive away, that are adding something to their community that's benefiting all people, not just a few people. I'm glad that you said that, and that's something that's very important to me, because I think men are hungry to know, what are we supposed to do? What do people want us to do? We know what you don't want us to do. We know, all the ways that we've, collectively been bad. But what are the ways that we're supposed to be good? Like, what is our role in society? What is the thing that men are supposed to be doing? And I think many men are very hungry to contribute in a positive way. And I'm not sure that we're offering a lot of times men a way to do that is palatable to everybody.
So Lucas is presented with an opportunity to respond to this young man who has, in a sense, chosen him by virtue of kind of camping out near him. And Lucas has to make a decision about, is he going to move towards this young man? Is he going to move away? Is he going to call the cop in the town to escort him off the property? That it's that moment of choosing that seems important in terms of masculine psychology. So one way we can think about this movement towards a more fulsome experience of the masculine spirit is to help men understand that there are more choices than they may instinctively realize. There are more ways. I found myself tangentially thinking about the work of a psychologist named Dave Grossman, who works a lot with military culture. And he's expanded this idea of fight or flight. And he says that around masculine psychology, fight, flight, or freeze is actually inadequate and not congruent. In his work, he writes about fight, flight, posturing, and submitting. And the posturing is the behavior that we see in the animal kingdom, where males will come together to compete. There will be a fierce display of posturing in one way or another, which often is a way of not killing each other, but actually displaying strength in one way or another. And this posturing behavior comes forward under duress, when things are calmer, safer. There's more grooming behavior, there's more collaborative behavior. And so Grossman was interested in wartime and the way that men would, under great distress, move into posturing. When I think about that, and many of the complaints, but not all, around toxic masculinity, I feel like men fall too quickly into posturing behaviors, chest out, coarse behaviors. And I think what's not appreciated underneath that is those men feel like they're in a war psychologically. And if men don't feel like that, they tend to actually be much more pro-social.
I think the great gift that Lucas has is that, you know, if we're going to say Darcy is the divine feminine, she tells him the boy is the way forward. Like, she blesses that. And also on the other side, he has Isaiah saying to him, you know, you need to help this boy. You know, he's kind of getting confirmation, he's getting encouragement, he's getting validation from both the masculine and the feminine are united in that. And I think that's what's so balancing for him and gives him the strength to move forward through this awful situation. It's being in harmony with both of those things that I think really allows him to be so effective in Eli's life. Perhaps the posturing is just this expression of, you know, this searching for validation or what's right, you know, or affirmation. And I think, of course, it's great when we can validate ourselves and we don't need that affirmation from outside of ourselves. But I think so many men are really struggling and just looking around. You know, what do people want from me? You know, what does the feminine want from me? What does the masculine want from me? And they don't know. And so I think for Lucas, the great gift that he receives is direct information from both sides of that coin.
And he has to resist a temptation because Sandra Coyle is inviting him into a warring feeling. Like, we're at war for the safety of our community. We're at war with these kids that are out of control. And if Lucas had succumbed to the invitation of war, it's much more likely that he would also have moved into kind of aggressive posturing impulses, which would not have permitted the kind of eros and mutual aid that he eventually found with the entire community, but particularly with this vulnerable young fellow that was reaching out to him. So there's something about stepping away from war in all of its forms that allows men to feel that they have options. Because when men feel like they are in war, primal instinct takes them over. And much of what we think of as toxic masculinity is in that realm of primal, instinctive, status organizing behavior, that seems really important to me in the novel, that there's a choice in how he's going to frame his grief and the potential danger in the community.
There's a bit too about, Lucas mentions about healing his ancestors through this process. And as I kind of psychoanalyze myself, which I always do after I write the novel and, just a fit. And then afterwards, I'm like, what does this mean? And what does it mean about me? Mm-hmm. But I can see how my grandfather and my Uncle Pete, World War II vet and Vietnam vet, very damaged, a lot of PTSD. They were very gruff with me, but they were also sometimes very gentle with me. And my grandfather really tasked me with, he used to call me the glue of the family. And he really wanted me to be a minister. And he really was pushing me to, I think in some ways, incarnate this shadow he had of the opposite of the warrior. And I didn't realize that at the time. My uncle even just encouraging me to write. And I remember my first YA book. It's called Sort of Like a Rock Star. It was very colorful, the cover, and it was about a teenage girl. And the last thing I ever thought my Vietnam vet uncle, who had a closet full of guns, would ever read. He was the first guy to read that book. And he loved it. And I remember him calling me. I thought he was going to make fun of me, but he's like, man, you better not sell the movie rights low on this one. This is a beautiful book. And it was so shocking to me that the thing that these men wanted, and they were very gruff with me. My uncle never called me Matthew. He always called me some derogatory word that I can't repeat on the podcast because it's so offensive. And he was the one that was engaging with this tender side of me that was creating, he was the one that needed that. And I didn't realize that I was kind of generationally tasked with balancing the scales of my grandfather and my uncle and my father too.
And you've done that not by being a minister, but by bringing these wonderful books into the world. And
Thank you.
That is quite a thing. Matthew, where can we find you? Where can listeners learn more about you?
So the novel is We Are the Light. And I hope your community will enjoy it. You can find me at MatthewQuickWriter.com. I do send out what I call monthly personal letters. So if you enjoy reading the letters I've written in the novel, I write a very intimate letter to my readers once a month, and you can sign up for that for free on my website. And I'll be out and about on book tours. So, check my website. Maybe I'm coming to your city and maybe I'll see you. I'd love to see everybody out at the talks.
And maybe there will be another movie.
There could be, yes.
Okay.
As always, there's always things churning.
We will be keeping our fingers crossed.
Yeah, it would be great to see a Jungian analyst up there on the silver screen.
Who would be your favorite person to play a Jungian analyst? Who would best represent, do you think? That's a loaded question. I'm sorry.
Maybe George Clooney.
Okay. Maybe if he's listening. He's directing movies now, too, so maybe he'll come on board. So.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us, and thank you so much for bringing Jungian analysis and Jungian work into the collective, letting people find more about that experience through your storytelling. And as a matter of fact, I could not think of any other work of literature that has put Jungian thought at the center of its theme, of its narrative. So as a Jungian, I think this is an extraordinary event. And the fact that the collective is interested in this speaks volumes to what's moving in the culture.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you for the work that the three of you do, which is beautiful. And it's certainly changed my life. So appreciate it.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.